Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good after midnight, whatever time you're watching this video. Welcome to another episode of Greg Blends. And it has been a while since I did a Let's Help episode, but I was scrolling through Reddit today and I found this thread. How can I improve the texture and create that white icing on top of the cereal? And then when we look at this, he's got looks like Froot Loops, I'm assuming. And then we go to this one, and that's gotta be Froot Loops, unless it's one of those, random off-brand dollar store knockoffs, but the general idea is Froot Loops. And I said, in the shader nodes, add a second principled BSDF shader and make sure make it 100% icing. With this shader hooked up, it should look like they're dunked / completely coated. Then use a mix shader to combine your color shader and icing shader. Finally, use a noise texture with the brightness and contrast or color ramp to drive the value of the mix shader. So bright areas of the noise are icing and dark areas are color. And then I said, edit, you've inspired me. I might make a YouTube video trying to create the perfect Froot Loops material. I'll link you here if I succeed. Well, I got pretty close, and this is that video that I felt inspired to do. So I linked some renders, and some people had some suggestions. So here is the current state of the shader. And it has a lot of nodes, as you can see. It's like you almost get vertigo looking at these nodes. But, despite the fact that this looks pretty complicated, it's actually not too bad. I'm going to take you step by step through this entire node setup, and I think by the end of it, you'll understand it. And also, hopefully, you'll be a little bit more confident about using nodes in Blender. I've gotten some comments on my YouTube channel that, people say they're scared of the node editor, or, I see that often, and I understand. When I was using Blender back in, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, whatever, I was terrified of the node editor. And that was before cycles even existed. I remember there was the node editor for Blender internal, and I had no idea how to use it, and it looked scary. But at some point, I started following tutorials, and I figured it out, and now I'm super comfortable in it, and I love it to death. So I'm going to try my best to explain what I did here. Now I have this render, and then this one, I have the saturation up, because when you look at reference material, these are pretty saturated. Now I don't know if that's because the person taking the photo just cranked up the saturation, or if they're actually this bright in real life. And there's some annoying motorcycles outside. I'd actually have to buy some Froot Loops and see, because every picture makes them look really bright, but I find it hard to believe that they're actually this saturated. But anyways, so I have this one with a lot of saturation, this one was kind of how it rendered normally, and then this was before I added the extra layer of icing. So, let's, I guess, just jump right in there. Now, as you can see, I kind of have groups. There's this whole little island of nodes. Then there's this island of nodes. And then there's down here just a little, this own island and so forth. You can see we have 3 of these principled BSDF shaders. And you'll see why later. Now, this third one I actually added later. So when I first did it, like I said, I had it looked like this. And then someone on the Reddit comments actually said I'd put more kind of the thicker coating of icing on it. So I added this extra one, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But first, I'd like to just mention some things about my scene and about my Blender. So in the scene, we just have a plane, bog standard plane, and then we have 9 of these toruses, and that's literally just by going to the add menu, choosing to add a torus. I cranked up the segments for both of these, but that's all I really did. So all of the magic, as you can see, these are all perfectly smooth. All of the magic happens in the nodes, and that's what's exciting. Now, because we're using displacement, which you can see right here, where is it? No, that's not where it is. It's over here. We're using displacement. We have to be in cycles. So I will be rendering this in cycles, and I have my render set to 512, and I have denoising data turned on. And we'll talk about that later, but this is a cycles tutorial. Because, as you can see, the donuts are perfectly smooth, but when they're rendered, they're all lumpy, and that's using displacement. The next thing is a lot of people comment on my Blender theme. I use a custom Blender theme. In fact, it's one that I made myself. I don't like Blender's light theme, it's too bright, and I don't like its dark theme, it's too dark. I feel like the 2.79 days kind of had a better theme, so I made my own. And I made the primary theme color teal with slightly blue grays for all of the other components. So they're not pure gray, they're actually slightly blue gray, which I feel like is a nice break from most software, which just tends to go with flat gray or black or white. I went with blue, gray, and teal. So this is my custom theme, but this is Blender 2.8, and if you want, I'll have a link in description on my website, gmiller.net/btheme. You can download my custom theme for 2.79 and 2.8. The last thing I'd like to address is in Blender, we have some preferences to set up. So one thing that people comment on is these lines. They're called noodles. So if you go to themes in Blender preferences and you go down to the node editor and you go down to noodle curving, let's make this smaller. By default in Blender 2.8 and beyond, it's at 0, so all the lines are straight. And I don't know why they made it 0 in newer versions of Blender. I really liked the bent lines, so I brought it back. The old value from 2.79 and prior is 5. Of course, you can go up even higher, but I have this little kink. I don't like it. It looks like a messed up garden hose or something. I don't like it. So I keep it at 5, and this is what the line behavior used to be. But it's still available in 2.8. But the other thing is, if you go into add-ons and you search for Node Wrangler and you add a checkbox next to that, we're going to be using that a lot. It's super helpful for understanding nodes, and it's called Node Wrangler, not Node Wrangler, like CG Geek says. This is just Node Wrangler. All right, so let's just jump in here and try to figure out what's going on. So the first thing is the colors of these Fruit Loops. So what you can do with Node Wrangler is click on this with Control and Shift, and you'll see it'll put a wire all the way down to this viewer node. And now if we go into rendered, you can see it's just a solid color. And I'm going to hide the floor for now because we don't need it. We're just going to be focusing on these Fruit Loops. So what do we have going on here? So if you remember, or if you haven't seen it, my antique gumball machine tutorial, I made a shader. Let's see, are we in HD here? Which basically randomly colors the gumballs. And so there's this node called Object Info, and every object in your Blender scene has a random number associated with it, and it won't change. It's like a permanent random number associated with that object. So I take the random number and I put it into a gradient, or as Blender calls them, a color ramp. And because it's a random number for every object, it'll pick a random one of these colors to color the gumballs. All right, so that's simple enough, right? So what I did is, the first thing I did is I just colored the Fruit Loops based on the same principle. So I duplicated the Fruit Loop 9 times. Each one has a random number, and then I put that into a color ramp. Now you might ask, well, why are the colors all distributed kind of weird? Because in the Antique Gumball Machine tutorial, the colors are distributed pretty evenly. Well, the reason why is because for the gumball, I was planning on having hundreds of them. But for the Fruit Loops, I only had 9, and I can't control which random numbers I was getting, so I just played with the dials until, I just dragged these left and right until I got a good mix of colors on the screen. Now we'll talk about the second one later, so just ignore this one down here for now. Okay, so the very first thing I did is I got an object info with random, and I set it to a color ramp, and I put in my Fruity Loops colors. Alright, so we can now control right click for slicing a wire. So I can node wrangle on this, so we can see that they each have a unique color, and then I can cut that. So the next thing is, as you can see, ignoring this one for now, this color goes into the color value of a hue saturation node. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk about these texture coordinates. So I have these texture coordinates going into two noise textures. So let's just node wrangle on this one, and you can see it has a noisy surface. If we node wrangle on this one, it's a slightly bigger noisy surface. So the cool thing is, with this texture coordinate node, you can get coordinates directly from the object and you don't have to unwrap the UVs yourself. So I didn't do any UV unwrapping for this entire material. I just used the object generated ones. So I put it into a noise texture, and then I use a map range node. So the next thing it does is it goes to a map range node. And basically I just said the noise texture goes from 0 to 1, but I want it to go from 0.5 to 1. I just changed that to range so that the noise would be at least a minimum of 0.5. And I wired that into the value of this hue saturation node. So I'm going to temporarily unplug this. And let's follow the same thing up here. So this time I use a noise texture which is a little bit bigger. And then I map it again, but this time I go from 0 to 1 to 0.45 to 0.55. And why did I choose those values? Well, it's simple. I'm going to unplug this as well. So here we have a hue saturation node. And as you can tell, it looks the exact same thing as our color ramp. It doesn't actually do anything. But let's observe this hue slider. It's by default 0.5. Well, what if we do 0.45? You can see it shifts the colors a little bit to the left. All right, let's go back to 0.5, which again is the same as default. But let's go to 0.55. It shifts the colors a little bit to the right. So keep an eye on this purple one, for example. It's purple. When we make it 0.5, it's still purple. It's just a little bit less purple, or it's more blue. And then we go 0.45, it gets even closer to blue. So obviously, if we crank this all the way to the extremes, you know, it's going to be pretty big. But this is basically the same thing as a hue slider in Photoshop. So let's see if you can follow what I'm doing here. I get the object coordinates. I use it to create a noise texture. But the noise texture is between 0 and 1. So instead, I use a map node to make it between 0.45 and 0.55. And as you can see, 0.45 is a little bit to the left and 0.55 is a little bit to the right. So here's the magic. When I take the result of our map range and plug it into hue, what it does is it creates a surface, but instead of just noise, it actually makes the hue a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right. So for example, in this green Froot Loop, you can see that the higher, brighter parts of the donut are a little bit more closer to the yellow side. I mean, I just called it a donut, the Froot Loop, are a little bit closer to the yellow side, and the dark parts are a little bit closer to the blue side. Same thing with here, like this is the pink Froot Loop, but the brighter parts of the noise are adjusted a little bit more on the hue to be closer to magenta. So, you know, we could play with these extremes a little bit more. So instead of going 0.45 to 0.5, we could do 0.4 to 0.6. And you can see the variance in hue on the surface is now a lot more. And, you know, we could just keep going, 0.3 to 0.7. Now it's really starting to do some crazy stuff on the surface, but I found that 0.45 and 0.55 do the trick well. So if we look at our reference material, you know, the surface isn't just one solid color of green. Like if I'm looking at this one, for example, there's a main color of green, but then there's little parts where the green is a little bit to the blue side. Here's a pink one that's mostly a dark pink, but then there's areas where it's a little bit to the light side. So I just used a noise texture, right? So noise texture to range so that we could control the hue. So that's basically what this whole area does. I use a random value to get a random color, and then with this hue saturation, I use a noise texture to kind of make the surface have different amounts of hue. But what about the second one? Well, this noise texture is kind of big, as you can see. But this noise texture is a lot smaller. The scale is 40 as opposed to 15. So the dots are a lot smaller. Well, I do a map range, but this time instead of 0.45 to 0.55, I go from 0.5 to 0.1. And this one goes into the value slot. So here's our hue saturation. And then we put this into value. And that noise texture now adds another layer to the color where there'll be dark spots. So now there's like a bunch of little dark areas mixed in with the hue saturation noise. Okay, so we've explained this entire area so far. So what's the deal, like Seinfeld, what's the deal with these extra nodes right here? Because if you look, this one looks almost the same as this one, right? We take the hue and put it into the hue slot. We take the map range, we put it into the value. But our color ramp is a little bit different. You can see this part is teal, this part's green, this part's green, this part's teal, this part's magenta, this part's purple, this part's... Right, you get the idea. So what's going on here? Well, if we were to look at this one, it would be the same thing, except it'd be a different set of random colors for the Fruity Loops, right? Otherwise, it's the exact same shader, it just starts with a different set of colors. Why? Well, let's look at our next set of nodes. So now we have another noise texture. All right, so it's the same thing that we saw here. It's object coordinates going into a noise texture, so nothing scary yet. And the scale is a lot smaller. It's 1.5. And then I put it into a color ramp. So let's take a look at this. And with this color ramp, you can see it turns it into mostly black, except for a few light spots. And those light spots are kind of, they fade off. They have a little bit of a gradient. But it's just a few light spots. Now, why? What's going on here? So here's the noise texture. This is going into a color ramp, right? Okay, so if we take this and we drag it to the left, or select the color ramp, you can see we get more surface area all the way until we get tiny little dots. Okay, well, why do we want that? Well, remember we have two different colors. We have this set of colors and this set of colors. So if we take the first set of colors and we wire that, let me just cut this long one. We wire that into the first slot on the mix node. And then we take our second set of colors and we wire that into the second slot. Okay, by default, it'll just mix them. But we take this color ramp and we use that as the factor for the mix node. And as you can see, it puts different little spots of the wrong color on the surface. Like you can see there's some underneath here, there's some purple. There's a little patch of purple on this one, green on this one, yellow on this one, and so forth. And why do we do that? Well, this was just a little fun extra feature I thought, but looking at this, you can see that when they're in the box, they get some of the coloring from their neighboring loops rubbed off on them. So we can see this blue one has a little bit of red stuck on it. This yellow one has a little bit of blue stuck on it. This red one has a little bit of yellow stuck on it, and so forth. So I thought it would be a fun, challenge to basically try to recreate that behavior. So after I created the first material, I just duplicated this with slightly different colors, but I made it have the same hue saturation value properties, and I just fed them into a color mixer. I used a noise texture to create a black and white map with a color ramp so that I could limit it to just spots. Now, if we were to do it like this, for example, and then look at the mix, you could see it'd be a lot more aggressive. But that's not realistic. That's not what I want. So, just by dragging these handles really close to each other, you narrow the range that you allow the noise texture to influence things. And then you just get little random patches, can make it more aggressive maybe, of the wrong color on each Fruit Loop. So now we've talked about, let's see, what does this one do? This one, okay, right. So so we'll talk about that in a second. So now we've explained this entire area. Now I hope I haven't lost you. that shouldn't have been too bad, right? I mean, we just get a random color for each object. We create two noise maps, one which is high frequency, one which is low frequency. We use the low frequency to adjust the hue. We use the high frequency to adjust the value. And then we mix that in with the color. We do it twice with a different set of colors. And then we just mix those with a black and white noise map that's very clamped in range. So that's where we are so far. So now the first thing I did is I'm just going to duplicate this principled BSDF. If we were to take the output of this and put it into the base color and then focus on this, this is the material that we've created so far. And I don't want subsurface on at the moment. So this is basically, I could have stopped here, right? This is, this is basically what we have. But there is no bump map on here. So, our normal doesn't have anything, right? And I haven't set up the displacement yet. This is just, there's nothing going on here. So I had to set up all the displacement and stuff as well. So we'll talk about why there's 3 of these principled BSDFs, but I just wanted to create another one so you could see that this is what it looks like after mixing. And then here's what it looks like with the displacement just directly into a shader. So now let's talk about the bump map. So turn this back on. So let's go over to this bottom left corner. And I think things will start to make sense. So let's just pick this one for now. So here we do the same thing. I have the, you can have more than one of these texture coordinate nodes. As you can see, I have one here, I have one here, and I have another one here. Just so I don't have to drag wires from one to like every possible place. So here we have 4 noise textures. Just a lot of noise. Here we have a nice, whoops, I don't want that, I want this. A high frequency one, then a middle frequency one, then an even lower frequency one, and then a very low frequency one. They're all driven by the same, object coordinates. And then this one, I put a color ramp on to create some dark holes. So basically I take this texture and I color ramp it so that I have some dark holes. And then with this, it goes into a couple different places, but the first place is it goes back up to our color. So remember, this is where we left off with our color. We have some of the little patches of the wrong color, but this is where we left off. Then I take that into an overlay node. So now those dark spots that I created are also added to our color. That's all that does. So this wire that goes up there, that's all that's happening. And then from there, this goes directly into the base color of our first principled BSDF. So now we're truly done with this entire upper area. But this one that has these dark holes also blends with just a higher frequency texture to create this. So here we have a bunch of little high frequency data and big dark holes. That sounds pretty terrible. And then I use an add node here. Now this add node's kind of confusing, but basically, remember how we created this black and white node group for the wrong color, right? So it mixes in the wrong color from other Fruit Loops. Well, that should probably be raised up just a little bit, right? Because it's stuck on the surface from another Fruit Loop. So what I did is I also took this color ramp where it's all black except for some white, and I mixed it into this. So here we have high frequency noise with a bunch of dark holes, and then I add, you can see it appear right here. So here's high frequency dark holes, and then I add a lot of brightness where that same color spot would be. So if you look right here on this guy, that's where it's yellow. This is where it's green. So in this, I now have a grayscale texture, and in the areas where it's like the wrong color, it's a bright highlight. Everything else is kind of a middle gray with high frequency noise, and then of course it has the holes, which will be like the porous surface of the cereal. So I just put this into a bump map. Just ignore the fact that there's a second one here for now. But I put this into a bump map. I set the strength to half and the distance to 0.1, and that goes into our first principled BSDF. So here we are with the first principled BSDF. You can see we have the color, and the surface now actually has bump detail on it, and that's just from this, right? So if we get rid of that, the surface will still have the color detail, but it looks very smooth. It looks like it's plastic, right? But we put this in the normal channel, and now we have that noise. And the important thing is, where there's the holes, like the cutouts, right? That's coming from the result of creating this black and white texture. So let's follow this all the way back, just to reiterate, to make sure you understand. So we have a texture coordinate, we do a high frequency texture, we do a low frequency texture, or slightly lower. We put that into a color ramp so that we have a bunch of holes. Then we mix that so we have both the high frequency and the holes at the same time. Then we add highlights for where the wrong colors should be. And at the end of this add node, we basically have this black and white surface, which we put into a regular old bump map node, which we then put into the normal slot. And that's what we have so far. Now let's talk about displacement. So if we go here, we see basically the same setup, just kind of the reverse of this. So we have a even lower frequency texture, which we then put into a color ramp to create even the most deep pitted holes on the surface of the donut. So whereas this is kind of like medium level pitted holes, this is the deepest ones, and you can see they're dark black. Then I have a very low frequency noise texture, and this is what will create the big lumps. Okay, so we mix those just like we did before. So now we have the low frequency texture with the deep pitted holes. And we put this into a displacement node. The displacement node then just goes all the way to our material displacement slot, all the way over there. So that's actually pretty easy to follow. So far we've explained pretty much everything, right? We've explained what's going on here. This is just creating the bump map noise. We've explained what's going on here. This just combines the bump map noise and adds in the lightness from here. We've explained how they're colored and mixed together. And yeah, so we've explained everything except for this node right here. So let's see where it comes from. It comes from the color node. And I put it into a hue saturation value, which desaturates it by 70% and turns the value down by 70%. So here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like after. And why did I do that? Well, this goes into the subsurface color. So if we unplug that and look at this, the subsurface color would be white, and it would look really weird and doughy. But with this, I put that into the subsurface color, and you can see I have 0.3 subsurface. Now, if you're unfamiliar, what subsurface is basically light can enter the surface of an object and scatter around. And most organic material does this. So if you're talking about flesh or like an insect or food, it almost always should have subsurface on, because unlike plastics and unlike metal, light can penetrate the surface of organic material, and cereal is just a grain, right? It's just, grains that have been baked into these little circles. So think of it almost like bread or something, right? So this should absolutely have subsurface on. But what color should the subsurface be? Well, I didn't want to use just the full saturation that we have here, so I just made a slightly duller version of the color for every Fruit Loop using this hue saturation, and that's what goes into the subsurface color slot. Okay, now I think I've explained almost everything here. So what's going on here? Well, let's look at this material real quick. And you can see this looks pretty good, but there is no icing on it yet. Oh, one thing I should mention. For the displacement, you have to have cycles on. Let me just go into wireframe real quick. as you can see, this is just a very high resolution torus, and I actually put a subdivision surface on here. So let's quickly just disable this subdivision surface in the viewport or the editor or whatever it's called. And now when we render, you can see the holes will be a lot blockier. Like, it'll be a lot more angular because there's just not, like, you can see these hard edges where, like, there's the displacement happening. But once we turn it on, you can see that that looks a lot better. So in order for displacement to work, you have to have a lot of geometry. And in your material settings, you just have to scroll down here, and for displacement, under settings, you want to say displacement only or displacement and bump. If you have it as bump only, it won't deform the surface. So if we put this as bump only, you can see these go back to being regular toruses. But you can do displacement only, or you can do what I like to do, which is displacement and bump, which adds a little bit of extra bump map to the rendering. So yeah, you have to do that in order to get the displacement to work. All right, so anyways, carrying on. So what's going on? So that's what this principled BSDF is. It's basically the Froot loop, but without icing. There's just no icing. Okay, let's add some icing. So what I did is I duplicated this principled BSDF, and I put it down here. And as you can see, it's basically an icing version of the same thing that we just did. So it still gets its color from all of these nodes over here. You can see the color that we put into the first one is the color that we put into the second one. So all that work we did over here, we're still using. We're just putting it into this one. However, the subsurface color is pure white, whereas this one has a subsurface color that's, you know, the same color as the actual Froot loop. So just that alone makes it look like icing. Now I did turn the subsurface down a bit because I didn't want it to be too I don't know, transparent or whatever. I do also have some transmission, but not a lot. And then, so if you think about in like the final render or whatever, the areas where there's icing should actually be raised up a little bit higher than the rest of the surface, right? Because icing has a thickness to it. So we already talked about how we go from here, which is the high frequency noise with the pitted holes and the areas for the wrong colors, going into a bump map, going into our regular material, right? Well, I just split that same grayscale map off, and I put it into a different bump node, except this one has slightly more distance, so it should be raised above the surface a little bit higher. All right, so now that you understand what this node is, well, I just take a mix shader right here. You can see this mix shader, and this is what I was talking about in, oh god, my computer's lagging so hard from cycles, in my Reddit post. I basically said, in the shader nodes, add a second principled BSDF. I just realized I said FD, BSDF, and make it 100% icing. With this shader hooked up, it should look like they're completely dunked / coated. Then use a mix shader to combine your color shader and icing shader. Finally, use a noise texture with brightness and contrast or a color ramp to drive the value of the mix shader. So that's exactly what I did. So this is the shader for the Froot loop with absolutely no icing. This is just an icingless, low carb, low calorie, whatever diet Froot loop. Whereas this is one that's completely dunked in icing. There isn't a single inch of it, a single millimeter that isn't coated in icing. I also made the icing one not rough at all, so it's also a little bit shiny. All right, so then once again, the pattern should be familiar from now. Just like we have here, a texture coordinate with a noise texture, texture coordinate with noise texture, texture coordinate with noise texture. Oh, look what we have here. Texture coordinate with noise texture. So when we look at this one, we can see that it's a medium frequency. And then I put it into a color ramp. And so this creates a very contrasty texture where parts are black and parts are white with a little bit of gradient in between. And I use that to drive the mix shader. So when we select this mix shader, you can see now that the areas of the noise texture where it's bright, it prefers the icing shader. And the areas where it's dark, it prefers the non-icing shader. So again, here's the noise texture that we created, dark areas and light areas. Here is the non-icing shader, and here's the icing shader. They both are wired into a mix shader, and then we just use this noise color ramp we created to drive the mix shader, so the areas where it's bright become icing, and the areas where it's not bright become the regular uncoded part of the Froot loop. So we're almost done, I promise. So that is pretty much everything explained, right? So to recap, this is all for coloring. This is for creating the bump map. This is for creating the displacement. This entire area right here is for displacement, which actually creates the distortion on the surface and cuts these holes out, for instance. Whereas this creates the bump map. The bump map is then split into two, one for the shader that has no icing and a different one for the shader that has icing. And I like to snap these whole, using a control or whatever, so they're nice and lined up. Just incidentally, when we created this texture, I also mixed it into the color just to add extra variance, so our colored surface has a little bit of darkness from there. But otherwise, we've explained everything, even down to this mix shader. Now, this is where I basically was done, and it looked like this. And that's when I posted, and I was like, here are my results. And then I posted that render with slightly different colors, and the node setup. And as you can see, if I open this up, that's it. I've explained everything in this picture. However, this guy said, great results, though I would add another mix shader and a very cranked color ramp to get the completely white spots as seen in the reference, on top of the soaked up parts of the icing. In the end, it's my take, but I like to have multiple levels of details in the shader, so you can do whatever you want. So that's what I did, and as you can see, I have those extra super bright spots where the icing is really coated on. Well, it shouldn't be a surprise, it's pretty easy to do at this point. So here we have another mix shader. Remember, this mix shader looks like this. It has the thin icing and then the icingless pieces. So I created another texture coordinate, another noise texture, which looks like this, and another color ramp, which looks like this. And this, basically when I'm designing these color ramps, what I'm trying to do is adjust the shape of the noise to look like what I want it to look like in the final mix. So I wanted, like he said in the reference, let's go over here, there's like these little globules of like very thick frosting everywhere, and this is a terrible reference material because everything is out of focus except for this one. But there's like the little globs where it's like very, very thickly coated on there, right? So when I was designing this noise texture, as I'm playing with these color ramp, sliders or whatever, I can make it more, I can make it extremely aggressive. I'm just playing with this until I find what I want the actual icing to look like. So I have that. Then I duplicated my icing shader. I made it look like this. This is just the icing shader by itself. And as you can see, it's cranked. It's very thick. So the subsurface is turned down, the transmission is turned down, and it's basically just white and white. So it's a very thick coating of icing. It looks like a frosted Cheerio or something, right? So then I use this color ramp and another mix shader, and I mix that extra layer of very thick icing on top of everything. And that is the shader. 40 minutes to explain. Hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming. Now, there are some caveats, right? So first of all, this is not a very efficient shader. It is noticeably slower to render, and every time you add nodes and complexity, things slow down. So what are some ways that this could be optimized? Well, I'm not going to go into that because, there's a lot of different ways, but I'll just mention some casually. I'm not going to actually show you them. So one way is to not use this thing. I used this color ramp thing because it's what I used in my gumball tutorial, and I thought it was a good idea. But technically, you could just duplicate this material 5 times and just have a color set once. Right? You don't have to use this method. In fact, if you were to just, for example, unplug this one and unplug this one, right, now we kind of have Apple Jacks or whatever, but this entire material, these nodes don't even need to exist. It doesn't even need to consider picking random colors, right? And then you could just duplicate the material and change the base color right here, and it would work just fine. But, you know, I thought I'll add this just because it's fun, and it's an easy way where I can just work with one set of nodes, but be able to see a bunch of stuff differently. Another optimization that could be done is I have a lot of noise textures all over the place, right? So there's a noise texture up here, there's 4 of them here, there's one here, there's one here, and I think there's another one here. So I have like 10 noise textures or something, right? Is that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, wait, no, 7, yeah. 8, 9. I think I have 9 noise textures over the entire course of this thing. Now, some of these noise textures could be combined. So, for example, if we look at this one, that's like, I don't know, pretty decent frequency. This is a high frequency one, and then I have a high frequency one here. That could probably be combined. That would improve performance. This one and this one are also almost the same, so those could be combined. But because I was working in this area and I didn't want my like lines to get super sloppy everywhere, I just duplicated them. But technically, you could save performance by just reusing the same ones. Same thing with this one. Here's a very low frequency one, another low frequency one. I don't know, this one is also pretty low frequency. Those could probably be combined. What about this one? This one kind of looks like this one. Actually, it looks the same. So those could be combined, right? So that's one optimization. I laid it out this way because it's easier to design. But if you make your shader and you're happy with it, you can then go in and get rid of redundancy. And every time you delete a node, that's just a faster render time, right? So this isn't necessarily the most optimal shader. And there's other things too. Like, for example, in retrospect, this whole missing wrong color thing, like, it's kind of dumb. Like, it sort of works, but it doesn't look super convincing. So, like, I could live without it personally. Like, if anyone's going to notice that, they might even just think it's a mistake, right? Like, when you see in the reference photo, it's very clear what happened with this. Like, oh yeah, it got some of the stuff stuck on it. I tried my experiment. It sort of worked, but it sort of didn't work. So I could live without it, basically. So, you know, doing the second color ramp and then trying to, you wouldn't even need these 3 nodes at all, because then you wouldn't be mixing the 2 colors, right? So this would be entirely unnecessary. So let's actually, I said I wasn't going to do this, but let's just do it. Let's duplicate this. So now we have a material that I can start chopping stuff. So I can delete this extra color node. We can delete this one. We can delete these 3. We no longer are mixing these, so this one can go straight into there. And then this add node is now unnecessary because we're not adding anything. So this, wait, where does this? This goes into height, right? Yeah, okay. So that can free up like a bunch of, what did I do? Why is it broken? Oh, because I only changed it for this. Right, okay. So where was I? We're here. Color. This one looks correct. This one looks correct. What's happening over here? Okay, everything is still okay. So that already will make it render a lot faster just by not having all that extra like overhead. So when I was explaining the material that I used to create this, it was including things like those little noise things, right? If you were to do a render now, each one would have entirely its own color. This one's still using the old material, so we can just go here and create this. No one in that spot will disappear, but now it will render slightly faster. And then, like I said, I think so this one, or is it, no, it's this one and this one are identical, so I could just wire this to there, and then we don't need these nodes. This one and this one are similar enough that we could probably just wire that to there and delete these nodes. I think this one was high frequency, right? So this one and this one, no, this one, are pretty similar, so I could probably just put this one here and delete that node, and then this one and this one are pretty similar, so this one could go into there, delete that node. Have we broken anything yet? Yeah, so our material still looks good, and we've actually chopped a lot of nodes out. Let's see, so I'm not entirely convinced that this extra one is necessary, so let's kill it. And I think that's about everything that we can realistically get rid of that's redundant and still have everything work. So maybe it doesn't look as good. It's hard to tell. I'd have to do a render, but let's quickly switch this back and then put this one on there. So yeah, I feel like the mix on this final icing doesn't look as good in our new material. And that would be this one, which is reusing this node. So let's go here and then adjust this a little bit. Maybe make this a little bit darker. It's hard to tell, still looks kind of odd, but I mean, you get the idea, right? So let's try it out on this one. Here's our new material. So we went from this to this, and this will render a lot faster, but you know, I got rid of a lot of redundancy. This is a lot harder to follow what's going on. It's also a lot harder to explain what's going on because you know, this node will be shared across like a lot of different things. This node will be shared across a lot of different things, and it's hard to explain, like, okay, we have a noise texture and it's going to be used in all these random different places. So when I designed this, I kind of kept things logical, right, or local. So these noise textures and this texture coordinate is all for the color stuff. This one is all for the bump map and the displacement stuff. This one is just for mixing the two. This one's just for mixing these two. You know, so I try to keep things in logical groups or whatever. But yeah, so it's a complicated shader. And right, so what I was saying is, I think I failed. So let's go back to OP's thing. So I guess OP is, I guess that's damn white. That's kind of funny. You know, he's like, how can I improve this texture to create the white icing on top of the cereal? Well, I did that, so in that sense, I didn't fail. But if you were to actually try to make a bowl of cereal, this is a very expensive shader, and it would be impractical, right? Your render would take forever. Also, you know, this depends on very high density geometry. So if we go into wireframe, this is I have basically 500,000 triangles just for this. Now, obviously, if you were to make a bowl full of these, you wouldn't have to have these as high resolution because they're going to be small, and you're going to be focusing on the bigger scene overall. Because I was doing a close-up render, I used very high resolution toruses in order for the displacement map to look correct. There could be better ways of doing this that don't involve displacement at all. For example, if we go into solid mode here, instead of using displacement in the material, we could go to modifier, put a displace modifier on here, and then just use a texture map. I'm not sure if you can use nodes with this modifier, but you could use a texture map and then apply it, and then use a decimate after that to get the geometry down. You can't decimate a shader displacement, but you can decimate a modifier displacement. And you can make the scene a lot lighter weight by doing that. But it wasn't my goal to do that. It was my goal just to create everything entirely in nodes. So what you see here is 10 high-resolution toruses that strictly just using nodes creates Fruity Loops. So, wow. I didn't think it was going to take almost an hour to explain all this, but, you know, it's everything about it is very simple. It's just complicated, if that makes any sense, right? It's like, yeah, it's nothing too crazy is going on here. It's basically just a bunch of noise nodes doing various noisy things, whether it's changing the hue, whether it's creating a bump map or creating a displacement map. It's basically just very, I don't know what the word is, very crafted noise. It's just careful, bespoke noise or something. Curated noise. How about that? It's curated noise, basically. You know, here's noise. Oh, let's go into rendering. I'm just going to put these back to our main material now, so let's go do that. So, like, here's noise, and then I curated it to be just these specs. Here's noise, and then I turned it into just these large holes. Here's noise, and then I turned it into just these bright spots. Here's noise, which I then used to drive hue and saturation. Here's noise, which I used to drive the value, right? We saw that. So it's just a bunch of using noise over and over again and then combining it in different ways, different and interesting ways. And then, you know, I used 3 different principled BSDF shaders, no icing, and then guess what? I use a mix shader with more noise. And then, you know, yeah, well, I already explained everything. I'm not going to go over it again, but you get the idea. So it's not, you know, it looks very complicated, but it's really the same pattern over and over again. It's just curated noise that's carefully stuck together to control either color, to control bump, or to control displacement. And those are really the only things that these nodes are controlling. It's color, bump, and displacement, but just a lot of noise nodes to do so. You know, if you were to try to render a bowl of cereal, this would be a very expensive shader. So I kind of went overboard. So sorry about that. If you're watching this video, damn white, sorry about that. I kind of went overboard because this wouldn't really be practical. But I had a lot of fun while doing it, and hopefully you learned something. Hopefully everybody who watched this can feel a little bit more confident after this video. Hopefully, you know, this wasn't too confusing, and hopefully you can go out and recreate something like this for yourself. But at this point, I am going to sign off. I don't think I have any social media for you today. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm still running the crowdfunding campaign to get a Pocket PC because, as I explained in previous videos, there was a version of Blender, which is extremely rare, that runs on mobile, but it's a very specific version of mobile called Pocket PC, and specifically only on iPaqs. I've tried it on other Pocket PCs and it did not work. It has to work on an iPaq. So I want to get one of these so I can torture myself playing with not only an ancient version of Blender, but an ancient version of Blender running on an ancient mobile device. So I have this fundraiser. A link will be in the description. But yes, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And I will be seeing you next time with this project. So I made the can from Jurassic Park that has the dino DNA in it, and that will be my next in my movie prop series. And after that, we'll be doing the sonic screwdriver. So this is coming up next. I animated it and everything, so you'll be seeing this in my movie prop series. But that about does it for today.